Good morning, church. I said that kind of sedate, and you guys responded with more energy than I gave you. So you guys are trying to give me some energy, I think, this morning. There were things left in the floor in my house, and Leticia knew it was me. And she let me know of this. And I'd been busy and whatever, and I immediately had an excuse. I had a good reason why I had left things messy the way I had. And I was very quick and passionate in my defense. Can anybody here identify?
Everybody's house.
Yes. How do you react? How do you respond when somebody accuses you of something? How do you feel about saying, who did this? Wasn't me. Anybody ever said that? You have three basic responses you naturally respond with when faced with guilt. You either deny it. I didn't do that. Somebody else did it. We rationalize it. Well, it was okay to do it in this case because of ABC reasons. Or we blame shift. We find somebody else to blame. Having children in my home, it's very having a child. I confess that many times I have blamed Shirley for things that have honestly, because I thought she had, and it actually ended up being me who left the mess, broke whatever it was. It misplaced, or actually I've accused Leticia on many occasions of hiding things from me. And actually accusing her of deliberately doing this just to frustrate me. And it turns out in many of these occasions that I actually put whatever the item was, wherever I ended up finding it later. And then I remember, oh, I put that there. How do we feel about that? Doesn't feel good, does it? There's something in us that cannot deal with guilt. The weight of guilt, the biblical word that we don't use as much these days in our society is sin. We can't deal with sin. How much of what we hear in the media that is negative about somebody really is ultimately accusing somebody of sin? Or even when somebody, I see this in I hate to bring up politics, but I hear this, the little bit that I hear of politics. I try not to listen very much to politics, but I hear even when someone of the opposing political party does something that maybe is good, they say the motive behind it is bad. Well, they're trying to do something bad somehow. I've actually heard that in some cases. A lot of our problems, I would say our fundamental problem is not knowing what to do with or how to deal with this thing called sin. And the title of our sermon today is The Gospel and Our Sin. And so that is something that's becoming a weirder and weirder concept for people, or has in the last few years. But even psychologists, secular psychologists, are starting to recognize that they really don't have an answer for a lot of these psychological problems that everybody's having, a lot of the anxiety, a lot of the depression that people are going through, because it actually goes back to an inability to deal with sin, their own, someone else's, a combination thereof, and it produces really negative psychological impact. A lot of drinking, a lot of drug addiction, a lot of the really bad, heavy, what we call, heavier sins or unacceptable sins that we identify. A lot of those have at their root, having talked with a lot of people and interacted with a lot of people who have serious life-impacting problems with drugs and alcohol and other types of sexual problems as well. And when you get down into the person and what's going on in them, it has to do with sin. And it's not that, and not in the sense that we're used to thinking about it as like, well, you did this and it's a sin, which is true. But there's something behind that. There's something deeper than that. Alan and I are scheduled to go in February to a workshop on the book of Ephesians. And in the book of Ephesians, it really breaks down sin in a different way. The sin, it talks about in chapter 2, following your passions. We're not going to read the text today because it would get a little too deep. But we follow our passions, our desires, and it says that these forces, these powers, actually control us through our desires and our passions. We don't kind of think that way. We kind of think, well, I did this and I did do it, but when we give into our desires, when we give into our passions, when we do things motivated by our own desires, there's something in those desires that comes from, according to the biblical narrative, which I believe is God's word and is telling us truth, that there's something in us human beings, starting back with the fall, that have rebelled against their Creator and said, I want to do things my way instead of yours. My will be done, not yours. Jesus says, may your will be done, not mine. And human beings, starting with Adam and Eve, started saying, no, my will, not yours, to God. And something about that has damaged human beings, you and I, on a very, very deep level. And the Disney theology of follow your heart is a lie. The Bible tells us that the heart is the most deceitful thing, and Jeremiah says it's deceitful above all things. There's something in the human heart that is deeply wrong. When it is shown to us, we tend to respond in the denial, rationalization, or blame-shifting way, and it's very, very painful to own. And a lot of times when we own the sin, we say, well, I did this, and we go into this mode where we start beating ourselves up. I'm terrible, I'm horrible, I'm a horrible person, and we start doing this thing, I call it self-flagellation. And that doesn't get us anywhere good, and it actually does not fix the sin problem. I don't know if anybody can relate to any of these reactions, but this is what human beings tend to do, basically at a very fundamental level, what we do when confronted with our sin. G.K. Chesterton, a famous theologian several years ago, several decades ago, was asked by some major, there was a, I believe it was Time magazine, one of the major publications of the time. They were doing research trying to figure out what is the worst problem in the world. What's the worst thing that we're dealing with? And they asked different people, they interviewed a lot of different people about this. What's the worst problem? Is it global? Today people might say it's global warming, it's war, it's child hunger, all these different big problems. We might, those of us who believe in God and we're trying to follow the Bible say, well, we say abortion's maybe the biggest problem. The human sexuality and what's going on with some strange things that are going on that in the culture. Maybe that's the biggest problem. Maybe it's some political group. Maybe it's some religious group. That's the biggest problem in the world. G.K. Chesterton responded with one sentence, 2 words. What's the biggest problem in the world? He says, I am. When we follow Jesus, when we look to his gospel, we're going to see today how that it is so powerful and so convicting with regard to our sin that it is something that is transformative. And it is not something that denies sin. A lot of today, there's a lot of things going on. There's a thing going on right now, and it's called in the general Christian community, it's called, the Churches of Christ may call it something, not use this term this exact way, but in general, they're calling it progressive Christianity. And what it's saying in general, this has been exposed, a lot of these churches that are called progressive Christianity, and they essentially are at the core of their doctrine, they won't deny this, will say, yeah, sin's not really that bad. They'll say Jesus died on the cross as an example of love to us, not because we really needed it to like somehow as a payment or a way of taking away sin. That's an actual doctrine that's become very, very prevalent. It's becoming more and more common in the culture as a whole, in the United States here as a whole. Hasn't made it to Latin America yet, as far as I can tell. That's recognized. We recognize that in Latin America is heresy. You're denying the core of Christianity. It's really been going on in a lot of churches for a long time, but a lot of people have been keeping quiet about it, and now it's become, ever since the last 10 years or so, apparently, from what I can tell, it's become much more prevalent and much more open, and more bigger churches that used to be, that would teach, what we call the core of Christianity, what we're talking about today, that sin is what the Bible calls it. It is rebellion against God. It is, sin is saying to God, my will, not yours. It is, actually, it goes deeper than that. There's one text that actually says anything that is not of faith is sin. In the book of Romans, he's talking about the eating of meats. I believe it's in Romans. He's talking about the eating of meats, and you do this, convinced that it's good, or maybe if I'm doubtful about what I'm doing. If you're not doing something out of faith to honor God, essentially within the context of the verse, you're sinning. I'm not doing what I do in Jesus' name. So I can even do good things. And sin is such a prevalent thing. I can do good things. Hey, I can stand up here and preach. Now, this is going to be really, I don't know how to call this. This is really revealing what can happen to us preachers. I can stand up and preach, and my sermon for me could be a sin, because I could be preaching the gospel to you, but doing it motivated out of pride, saying, hey, guys, look at me. Aren't I a great speaker? It's a big danger for people who preach the gospel, because we little by little, this can become like okay, people are looking at me and hanging on my every word. It can become an ego thing. So I can be doing good things for the wrong reasons, and I can be sin. It's a big problem the Pharisees had. Okay, sin is a deep thing. It is not something that we can deny. It's not something we can rationalize or justify ourselves. It's not something we can put on another regular person, and it's definitely something when we tend to beat ourselves up about it. So we're going to look at two people today, and how two people dealt with their sin. We're going to look at Simon and a sinful woman. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. So here's Jesus. We don't know how much he's said at this point, because sometimes that we're not really clear on the chronology of the Gospels. If they didn't record history back in those days exactly chronologically. We don't know how much he's offended the Pharisees, but this particular Pharisee named Simon, he has invited Jesus over to have dinner, and to have dinner with someone in that day and time was very significant, because when you had to sit down and eat with someone was a very intimate act. And when I invite you over to eat, it still has kind of an intimate act today. If you're married and and your spouse goes and has dinner by themselves with someone else of the opposite sex, how do we feel about that? Not so good, right? That's a little too intimate. This is a level of intimacy that we should only share with our spouse, right? So we kind of have that concept a little bit today. But he goes to this Pharisee's house, and this is an invitation of the Pharisee. I'm honoring you, Jesus, that you could have a relationship with me. I'm considering having a relationship with you. I'm checking you out. That's kind of this guy's attitude. At the same time, a woman in that town who had lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. So we've got Simon, and we've got this very sinful woman. Most commentators agree that, these historians, these scholars that have looked into this, into the context and in the way things worked in first century Palestine, they agree pretty much this woman was probably a prostitute. There's very little doubt that she was prostituting herself. So she's using her sexuality to get financial gain, something that we've talked about in previous weeks, how that a woman's her sexuality really was for procreation, and it was, of course, that is true biologically, and that is true spiritually. That is one of the things that a woman's her sexuality is for. and it is definitely not something used for financial gain. And she comes with an alabaster jar. Very probable that this jar has been filled with expensive perfume purchased with what she's been doing with her sexuality, okay? So what she's been doing with her personal business, prostituting herself, she's been filling this jar. The purpose of this jar, this type of jar, so a flask that women a lot of times at that time would wear around their neck, what they usually used this for this was something that was a symbol of her beauty. It was a symbol of what she was going to give her. A single woman would wear something like this to be something that she would one day share with her husband, being able to break this open and maybe share this beautiful smell, this wonderful smell on maybe their wedding night. Sometimes also they would, a woman, when she had a young unmarried woman, had a flask like this, and she became betrothed to a young man, or maybe not so young a man, but she became betrothed. She would take in, as a symbol of her devotion to her soon-to-be husband, she would break the flask at his feet. And saying it was a way of saying, all my beauty, all that is desirable, my desirableness is yours. I'm giving it to you. And this woman, we don't know what interaction the two of them, Jesus and this woman, or Simon the Pharisee and Jesus have had prior to this moment, but something has happened apparently that has provoked this reaction, this woman. So she shows up. As she stood there behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. So Jesus, he's at the table and he's reclining. People back then didn't sit at chairs and tables. The tables were lower and they maybe lay down and reclined on a cushion. And so their head would be close to the table and their feet would be away from the table. So he's laying there and she would have come up behind him. And she's looking at him and she sees that nobody's washed Jesus' feet. Before you, the basic common courtesy when you come into somebody's house is you either wash their feet or have a servant wash their feet, or you at least give them some water to wash their feet. There's no water there. So she just looks at him and sees his dirty feet. And she gets down there and she's just weeping on him. And her tears are so profuse that she's able to use them to clean his feet. And another thing about women at that time is they would never leave their house with their hair down. They would always wear their hair up. A lot of ladies today don't like to go out with their hair down, right? You don't want to go with your hair not fixed just right. Well, it was very unacceptable for a woman to go out with their hair down. To let your hair down, just like today, I'm going to let my hair down a little bit. I don't have too long a hair to let my hair down. But a woman, it was a very intimate and very personal, it was a very vulnerable thing to do. To be seen with your hair let down was a very intimate and a vulnerable gesture. So she's weeping on him and she's washing his feet with her tears. And so she takes her hair down and she starts wiping them and drying them off and cleaning them with her hair. And she kisses them. Kissing, it was not necessarily the type of intimacy that we usually associate with kissing today. The kissing then was a greeting. It was a way of showing affection. It was actually often a familiar way, a family way of greeting someone. When your brother, your father, your mother, your sister came, you would kiss them, usually on the cheek or the forehead. But she doesn't even bother to go over to where Jesus' head is. She doesn't go that high. She just wants to I just want to be at his feet. She kisses his feet affectionately. And that little flask that she's been pouring everything into, everything she can save one day for that special man that was maybe going to love her for the beauty she could show them. For the desire, so the man who would truly desire her, she saved it for the man. And she takes it and breaks it and pours it on Jesus' feet. This is an extravagant and lavish and scandalous show of affection and love for Jesus by this woman. It's amazing. I think I need to go back. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. So he's already decided in his mind, this act demonstrates that Jesus is not who he says he is. Jesus is a pretender, or at least who he's presenting himself to be. He's presenting himself to be a prophet. I'm a guy who studied the Bible all my life, knew it by heart. From my understanding of Scripture, the prophet should know this kind of person, shouldn't allow this kind of person to touch them, much less a woman who's not his wife, is not his sister. This is not appropriate. So he's looking at this from the appropriateness. He's looking at this from the standpoint in a very, what we would call judgmental. And so the natural reaction of the person who is like this Pharisee is to immediately judge the other person. What he sees is automatically something negative in Jesus. This is how he perceives it. Now I'm going to suggest that how you perceive and how you judge other people says often more about you than it does about the other person. When you're very quick and very abrupt like this to judge another person. So Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. And so Jesus, Simon thought this. He didn't say this. He thought it. So Jesus is now showing him that he's a prophet because he's responding to Simon's thoughts. He says, Jesus says to him, Simon, I have something to tell you. If Jesus says, I have something to tell you, watch out. He's about to get you, okay? He's about to show you something that's going to hurt. It's going to hurt what he's about to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain money lender. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love more? So he's showing Simon. Simon doesn't understand. He thinks he understands the woman. He thinks he understands Jesus, what's going on, what a prophet should be. He's got expectations, and he thinks he understands himself. And Jesus is about to show him he doesn't understand any of that. He doesn't get any of that. And he tells the story. He tells the very quick parable. 2 people owe money. I remember I was in a situation one time, a long time ago, right out of college, and I was short on cash, had famous debt, not the kind of debt a lot of people are accumulating now apparently, but I had some debt getting out of college, and I just got my first job, ironically, here in the Atlanta area when I lived here. Rent was a lot more than what I'd paid living in Auburn, Alabama, and my first paycheck came, and guess what? It was not enough to cover rent. That was a very painful phone call back to Alabama. Can somebody send me some rent money, because my first paycheck was not what I expected it to be. I can't cover it. That was a very painful thing. It's very painful to be short. Back when everybody paid for things in cash, and didn't have a credit card, and you go out to dinner and you realize you didn't bring enough. You invited a girl out, and you're going to pay, and you realize that you're not going to pay. I had a friend, he invited a girl out, and she ordered. After she ordered, he saw the prices of the things he ordered. He said he's going to have a glass of water. Yeah. So not being able to cover what you owe, it's a very painful, it's a very scary thing. And they say that people worry more about money a lot of times than they do about dying. They're more worried about they're afraid they'll have more life than they will have money. And so or some people are in situations, they say they have too much, how's it that Dave Ramsey always says, I have too much month at the end of my money. And so he's saying 2 people find themselves in this situation. It's painful, humbling, humiliating situation that I can't pay what I owe. So one owes 50 and one owes 500. Well, you know, I owe you $5. Maybe I owe you $5,000. Why do we call it $5 when it's a little bit? When we say $5,000. When you speak two languages, you think a lot about why you say things the way you do. But anyway, we do sometimes say $5,000. Anyway, so we've got a small amount of debt and a large amount of debt. And the natural reaction, that's what Jesus asks. He says, he's showing the woman and Simon, here's you two guys, you're two debtors. Who's gonna love the lender more? Well, I suppose the one who had a bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned towards the woman and he said to Simon, you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. So Jesus is showing Simon, you want to know what's going on? You want to see how I see this woman? Very different. See, we tend to be cultural, or we tend to be relativists when it comes to sin. As long as my sin is not as bad as other people's sins, or if my sin is an acceptable sin, then I'm okay. And we feel maybe a little better about it. What are some acceptable sins? And maybe, I know this would never happen in this church, getting to know you. I'm sure you guys don't have this problem. Gossip. Talking about other people and speculating about, especially negative things about them, and spreading that around, and little by little it becomes truth. And I remember that happened one time at a place when I was single. I found out I was getting married, and I wasn't even dating the person I was supposed to be getting married to. I wasn't dating anybody. Yeah, rumor, things happen, and we spread things, gossip. That's never been a problem, is it? That's an acceptable sin. We don't usually kick people out of church for gossip. Is gossip damaging? Can be very damaging, can't it? What are some things that are unacceptable? Drugs, alcohol. Well, I'm not guilty of the big sins. I'm not guilty of these things that are just really, really horrible. So what do? We feel okay because relative to this other person, we've decided collectively in our society that these are the big sins and these are the little sins. Even though we don't really talk about it that way, we kind of feel good about ourselves. But if we were to look at ourselves the way Jesus looks at us, we would realize it's like, I'm just a debtor just like this other person is. My sin, whether it be big in my eyes or little in my eyes, is just as ugly to Jesus. It put Jesus on the cross just as much as the prostitute, just as much as the drug dealer, just as much as the gang member, whatever, name the heinous sin, your little sins put Jesus on that cross just as much as the person with the quote-unquote bigger sins. Your sins are forgiven, he says to the woman. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? So Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. What are you going to do with your sin? Are you going to deny it? Are you going to rationalize it? Are you going to shift it over to somebody else? Are you going to own it and then beat yourself up over it? None of those are what Jesus wants you to do. None of those are what he did with this woman. He forgave her sin. And he forgave her sin based on his blood, his sacrifice. What are you going to do? Are you going to come to him? Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Sin is a weight that you cannot bear. The more you recognize how you're evil, your participation in these dark forces that tend to control us and inflame our desires and take us in ways that we call sin, the more you recognize that, the more you will have a responsive love to this person named Jesus, who we've said previously is both Lord and He's your Savior. He wants to respond to that today. He wants to maybe come, and maybe you already are a follower of Jesus Christ and you want to renew your relationship with Him. Maybe you want to come and ask for public prayer. Maybe you need to meet with one of the elders separately and maybe pray with them. Have a person who is trustworthy, who is loving, and a person who is strongly believing in a strong believer in God's grace. Come see them. Come to Jesus right now. Maybe you want to put Him on in baptism. We have water prepared in the back. We could baptize you today as well into Him. May God bless you.